Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is October 28th. On this day in 1971, it was a quiet weekday morning in Houston, Texas. 19-year-old Gloria Ann Gonzales left her apartment on Jacqueline Street and disappeared into the city. We don't know how she spent her day. Maybe a walk, a bus ride, maybe a few errands. But hours passed, the sun went down, and she didn't come home. 3 weeks later, her skeletal remains were discovered near the Addicks Reservoir on the western edge of Houston. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The place where she was found would later become part of a landscape with a chilling nickname, the Texas Killing Fields. Today, we're talking about the disappearance and murder of Gloria Gonzales, one of the victims of the Texas Killing Fields. Let's get started. In 1971, Houston was booming. The oil and aerospace industries were both huge, and the city was growing along sprawling highways. For a 19-year-old like Gloria, it was a city full of possibility and risk. She was living in an apartment on Jacqueline Street, working and making plans for her future. She was on her own, but she had family in the area who cared deeply for her. On that Thursday morning, October 28, 1971, neighbors saw her walking near her building. But no one saw her after that. At first, Gloria's disappearance barely registered outside of local bulletins. Houston was already struggling with a rising number of missing young women, and Gloria's case seemed to blend into a growing list of unexplained vanishings. For her family, though, the silence was unbearable. Each day without an answer felt heavier than the last. In the weeks that followed, officers canvassed the area around her apartment with little to show for it. Tips came and went. Then, on November 23, 1971, a grim discovery ended the waiting. Hunters near the Addicks Reservoir stumbled across skeletal remains scattered in the brush along the water's edge. The location was remote, a tangle of reeds, mud, and still water just beyond Houston's suburban sprawl. Forensic testing confirmed the remains were those of Gloria Ann Gonzales. The coroner determined that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. It was a violent death that was likely inflicted not long after she vanished. Even in tragedy, there was another chilling detail. Her remains were not alone. They were found within yards of another missing girl, 13-year-old Colette Wilson, who had disappeared 5 months earlier. 2 young women found side by side on the same isolated patch of land. It was the kind of coincidence that investigators couldn't ignore. In the early 1970s, local law enforcement began noticing something terrifying: a cluster of disappearances and murders stretching from Houston down to Galveston along Interstate 45. Teenage girls and young women were vanishing. Some had been on their way home from work. Others were last seen hitchhiking, going to the beach, or walking near their neighborhoods. When bodies were found, they were often discovered in isolated places: bayous, oil fields, drainage ditches, or the desolate reservoirs outside of the city. Gloria's case became one of the earliest in what the public would later call the Texas Killing Fields, a term that came to describe not just one killer, but decades of murders that shared haunting similarities. In 1971 alone, 6 young women went missing under similar circumstances: Colette Wilson, Debbie Ackerman, Maria Johnson, Sharon Shaw, Rhonda Renee Johnson, and Gloria Gonzales. But police at the time had few tools, and multiple jurisdictions, Harris, Brazoria, and Galveston counties, meant that investigators often ran in parallel instead of together. Leads grew cold and evidence deteriorated. And for the families, answers stayed heartbreakingly out of reach. Over the years, investigators revisited the case as technology advanced. DNA testing, mapping, and cold case reviews have brought occasional glimmers of hope. One name continued to surface over the years: Edward Harold Bell. Bell is a convicted murderer and sex offender who was already serving time for an unrelated killing when in 2011 he wrote letters to the authorities and the Houston Chronicle claiming responsibility for 11 murders of young women, all between 1971 and 1977, and these cases included Gloria Gonzales. In his letters, he called them the 11 who went to heaven. Investigators followed up but found no solid evidence linking Bell to Gloria's death. The details in his accounts were vague, sometimes contradictory, and prosecutors ultimately couldn't charge him. Bell died in prison in 2019, taking whatever truth he held with him. So Gloria's case, like so many others from that era, remains officially unsolved. It's easy, decades later, for the names to blur into lists. But Gloria Gonzales wasn't just one of many. She was a daughter, she was a friend, and a young woman trying to find her footing in early 70s Houston. She was 19, barely out of high school, and living in a city that promised independence but offered too few protections for young women navigating it alone. Her story reminds us that every unsolved murder represents not just a mystery, but a missing life. Gloria's name still appears on lists of victims connected to the Texas killing fields, and cold case investigators continue to re-examine those files. Advances in DNA, forensic anthropology, and forensic genealogy may one day offer answers that weren't possible in 1971. The killing fields have become shorthand for horror. More than 30 victims are tied by geography, if not by one killer. But for the families, it's more personal than any headline. Each name is a daughter, a sister, a friend who never came home. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Gloria's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe. And remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!